She stood in my living room with the eviction notice, smiling as she told me I had 48 hours to get out. The house belongs to me now, Margaret. Time for you to figure out your own life. At the lawyer's office 2 weeks later, she practically danced in her seat as they read through my daughter's will. Then the attorney pulled out the second envelope, the one sealed with red wax, and her face went pale. Before we conclude, he said slowly, there's one more provision that Victoria added 3 weeks before her death. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're from. And smash that like button if you love watching karma catch up to people who deserve it. Because what I'm about to tell you is how my daughter-in-law went from gloating over my misfortune to discovering that some battles are lost before they even begin. Sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who've been 10 steps ahead all along. The phone rang at 2:43 in the morning on a Thursday in late September. That's the kind of detail that gets burned into your memory when your world is about to shatter. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, knocking over a glass of water in the process. At 71 years old, middle-of-the-night phone calls only mean one thing, and it's never good news. Mrs. Chen? The voice was professional, careful, the kind of tone people use when they're about to break your heart. This is Dr. Ramirez from St. Catherine's Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Victoria. My daughter, my only child, the light of my life, the girl who'd grown into a brilliant, 38-year-old architect with her whole future ahead of her. What's happened? My voice came out as barely a whisper. I was already standing, already moving toward my closet, already knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. There's been an accident. A car accident on Highway 101. I'm so sorry. Mrs. Chen, but Victoria didn't survive. She was pronounced dead at the scene at 1:47 this morning. The phone slipped from my hand. I heard the doctor's voice, tinny and distant, still talking from where the phone had landed on the carpet. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing, trying to process words that my brain refused to accept. Victoria, dead. My baby girl, dead. I don't remember picking up the phone again. I don't remember the rest of the conversation. The next thing I clearly recall is sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot at 4:00 a.m., unable to make myself go inside, unable to face the reality of identifying my daughter's body, unable to accept that the universe could be cruel enough to take her from me. When I finally walked through those automatic doors, I found Natasha already there. My daughter-in-law was sitting in the waiting area, her designer handbag placed carefully beside her, her phone in her hand. She looked up when I approached, and I searched her face for the grief I felt crushing my own chest. What I saw instead was something I couldn't quite identify. Not grief, not shock, something else. Something that made my stomach turn. Margaret. She stood up, making no move to embrace me. We'd never been close, Natasha and I, but Victoria had loved her, and that had been enough for me. I suppose we need to make arrangements. Not, I'm so sorry. Not, I can't believe she's gone. Not even, how are you holding up? Just a cold statement about arrangements, as if we were planning a dinner party instead of a funeral. I want to see her, I said, my voice breaking. I've already identified the body. There's no need for you to put yourself through that. The words were thoughtful, but the tone wasn't. There was something territorial in the way she said it, something that claimed ownership over my daughter, even in death. She was my child, Natasha. I need to see her. Natasha's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Suit yourself. I'm going home. We can discuss the funeral arrangements tomorrow. She picked up her expensive handbag and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor with each step. I stood there in that fluorescent-lit hallway, watching her leave, and felt the first whisper of something that would later grow into full-blown alarm. This wasn't how people acted when they'd just lost their spouse. This wasn't grief. This was something else entirely. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and the kind of soul-crushing grief that makes it hard to remember to breathe. I called Victoria's friends, her colleagues, her extended family. Each conversation was a fresh knife to the heart as I had to say the words over and over again. Victoria is dead. Yes, a car accident. No, she didn't suffer. At least that's what they told me. Natasha, meanwhile, had taken complete control of the funeral arrangements. When I tried to offer input or help, she shut me down with the same cold efficiency she might use with an incompetent employee. I've got it handled, Margaret. Victoria and I discussed her wishes many times. I know exactly what she would have wanted. I'm her mother. I think I should have some say in... You're her mother, yes, but I'm her spouse. Legally, the decisions are mine to make. The word spouse carried extra weight, as if she needed to remind me of the hierarchy. As if I might forget that in the eyes of the law, Natasha had more claim to my daughter than I did. I tried to push down my growing unease. People grieve differently, I reminded myself. Maybe Natasha was one of those people who dealt with tragedy by taking control, by staying busy, by refusing to let emotions show. Maybe underneath that cold exterior, she was falling apart. But I didn't believe it. Not really. The funeral was held at Riverside Memorial Chapel on a gray Saturday afternoon that seemed designed for mourning. Natasha had spared no expense. The flowers alone must have cost thousands of dollars. Enormous arrangements of white roses, lilies, and orchids that filled the chapel with their cloying scent. The casket was top-of-the-line mahogany with brass handles. The program was printed on heavy cardstock with gold foil lettering. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely wrong for Victoria, who had loved wildflowers and simplicity and would have been horrified by this ostentatious display. I sat in the front row, surrounded by people offering condolences that I barely heard. My eyes were fixed on the casket that held my daughter's body, trying to make sense of a world where such a thing was possible. Natasha sat beside me, dry-eyed and composed, accepting sympathies with gracious nods and carefully practiced expressions of sorrow. She looked stunning in her black designer dress, her hair and makeup perfect, every inch the grieving widow. But she wasn't grieving. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond logic or proof. She was performing. During the reception after the service, I overheard a conversation that confirmed my suspicions. I'd gone to the restroom, and as I was washing my hands, I heard voices in the hallway just outside. Natasha's voice, and another woman's. Her sister, if I remembered correctly. Well, at least the life insurance will cover all this, the sister was saying. How much did you say the policy was for? $350,000. Natasha's voice was low but clear. Plus Victoria's retirement accounts, the house, the car, everything. I'll be set for years. What about Margaret? Where will she go? There was a pause. Then Natasha laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. That's not my problem. She can figure it out like everyone else. I'm not running a charity for elderly relatives. My hands gripped the edge of the sink as the room tilted around me. For the past 3 years, ever since my husband Robert died and I'd sold our family home, I'd been living with Victoria and Natasha. It had started as a temporary arrangement, just until I found a suitable apartment, Victoria had said. But months had turned into years, and it had become permanent. I'd contributed to the household, of course. I cooked, cleaned, helped with expenses when I could on my modest retirement income. I'd even given them $35,000 toward the down payment on their house, money from the sale of the home Robert and I had shared for 40 years. And now Natasha was planning to throw me out. I waited until the voices faded before leaving the restroom. For the rest of the reception, I watched Natasha with new eyes, seeing clearly what I'd been trying not to see for years. The calculating glances, the way she measured people's worth by what they could provide, the barely concealed contempt she showed toward anyone she deemed beneath her. How had Victoria not seen it? Or had she seen it and loved Natasha anyway, hoping that love would be enough to soften those hard edges? As the last guests were leaving, Natasha found me standing by the flower arrangements, lost in thought. "Margaret, we need to talk." Her voice was businesslike, the performance of grief already dropped now that the audience was gone. "About the living situation." "I heard you," I said quietly. "In the hallway, talking to your sister." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't bother denying it or looking embarrassed. "Then you know where we stand. I need space to process my grief, and having you in the house is complicated." "Complicated?" "Victoria felt obligated to take care of you. I don't share that obligation." She crossed her arms, her stance defensive but her eyes hard. "I'll give you 2 weeks to make other arrangements. That's more than fair." 2 weeks. 2 weeks to find a place to live, to move my belongings, to figure out how to survive on Social Security and a small pension that barely covered basic expenses. "Victoria would be ashamed of you," I said, my voice shaking with anger and grief and disbelief. "Victoria's dead." The words came out flat, brutal. "And the sooner you accept that, the better off we'll both be. I'll see you at home." She walked away, leaving me standing alone in the chapel with my daughter's flowers and the wreckage of my future. I spent that night in Victoria's childhood bedroom, the one Natasha had grudgingly let me keep when I moved in. The walls were still painted the pale yellow Victoria had chosen when she was 16. There were marks on the doorframe where we'd measured her height every year. A small bookshelf still held her college textbooks and a few worn paperbacks she'd loved as a teenager. This room was all I had left of my daughter's early years, and soon I wouldn't even have this. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced through possibilities, all of them bleak. My savings account held maybe $8,000, enough for a security deposit and a couple months' rent if I could find something affordable. But in this city, affordable was a relative term. Most one-bedroom apartments rented for $1,500 or $2,000 a month, far more than I could sustain long-term. Senior housing was an option, but the waiting lists were months or even years long. Friends I could stay with? My closest friends were either dead or living in retirement communities themselves. My sister lived in Florida and barely had room in her own tiny condo. As the sun rose on the day after my daughter's funeral, I faced the reality that I was, for all practical purposes, about to become homeless. Natasha gave me those 2 weeks exactly, no more and no less. She counted down the days with the same cold efficiency she might use for a business deadline. On day 13, I was still frantically apartment hunting when she appeared in my doorway. "I'm hiring cleaners to come tomorrow to prepare this room for guests," she announced. "You'll need to be completely moved out by 6 p.m. tonight." "But you said 2 weeks." 2 weeks from the funeral. It's been 13 days. That's close enough." She glanced around the room with undisguised disdain. "Honestly, Margaret, you should be grateful I gave you this much time. Most people wouldn't have been so generous." Generous. She actually used the word generous. I spent that final day packing my life into whatever boxes and suitcases I could find. 71 years of living, reduced to what would fit in my 12-year-old Honda Civic. Photographs of Victoria as a baby, as a child, as a young woman. Robert's watch, my mother's jewelry, clothes, toiletries, a few books I couldn't bear to part with. Everything else, furniture, kitchen items, decorations, had to be left behind. There was simply nowhere to put it. At 5:45 p.m., Natasha appeared in the doorway again. This time she was holding her phone, presumably ready to call the police if I didn't leave voluntarily. "Time to go, Margaret." I looked at her standing there in the doorway of my daughter's childhood room, and something inside me finally broke. Not broke into tears or rage, but broke into a kind of cold clarity. "You didn't love her," I said quietly. "Victoria gave you everything, and you didn't love her at all." For just a moment, Natasha's mask slipped. Something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, anger, defensiveness. Then it was gone, replaced by that same cold indifference. "Love doesn't pay the mortgage, Margaret. Victoria understood that, even if you don't. She stepped aside from the doorway. Your 2 weeks are up. Leave, or I'll have you removed. I picked up my last suitcase and walked out of that house, out of the home my daughter had made, without looking back. If I'd looked back, I might have broken down completely. And I needed to hold on to what little dignity I had left. The Hampton Inn off the interstate became my home. $95 a night, which would devour my savings in a matter of weeks. The room was generic and depressing. Beige walls, industrial carpet, a bed that was somehow both too soft and too hard. But it had a door that locked and a roof that didn't leak, which made it better than a lot of alternatives. I sat on that bed that first night and let myself cry for the first time since Victoria's death. I cried for my daughter. I cried for myself. I cried for the future I'd thought I'd have, helping Victoria raise the children she'd been planning to have, growing old with purpose and family around me. Instead, I was alone in a hotel room, counting the days until my money ran out. 3 weeks into my hotel stay, just as I was seriously considering whether I could afford to eat more than ramen noodles for the foreseeable future, my phone rang with an unknown number. Mrs. Chen, this is Jonathan Pierce from Pierce Anderson and Associates. I was your daughter Victoria's attorney. My heart clenched. Another bill I couldn't afford? More paperwork for a death I was trying to process? Yes, Mr. Pierce, how can I help you? Actually, I'm calling because I need your help. Or rather, your presence. He cleared his throat. I'm handling Victoria's estate, and there will be a formal reading of her will this Friday at 2 p.m. Your attendance is required. Required. The word stuck in my mind. I'm sorry, but I'm confused. Natasha said that everything went to her as the surviving spouse. Why would I need to be there? Victoria's will has multiple provisions, Mrs. Chen. I'm not at liberty to discuss them over the phone, but I can tell you that you are specifically named as a beneficiary. Please bring photo identification and any documentation you have of your relationship to the deceased. A beneficiary. The word felt surreal. What could Victoria have possibly left me? Maybe some personal items, photographs, jewelry, something Natasha had overlooked or decided she didn't want. I'll be there, I told him. That Friday, I drove to the law offices of Pierce Anderson and Associates with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The office was in one of those modern glass buildings downtown, the kind with marble floors and expensive art on the walls. I felt out of place in my department store dress and sensible shoes, but I held my head high as I announced myself to the receptionist. Mrs. Margaret Chen for the 2 p.m. reading of Victoria Chen's will. The receptionist smiled professionally. Yes, Mrs. Chen. The others are already waiting. Conference room B, down the hall to your right. Others, plural. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by thick carpet, and pushed open the door to conference room B. Natasha sat at the large conference table, dressed in black as if she were still in mourning, though I noticed her outfit was a different designer ensemble than she'd worn to the funeral. She looked up when I entered, and her expression darkened immediately. "What is she doing here?" Natasha demanded, not to me, but to the man sitting at the head of the table, presumably Jonathan Pierce. "Mrs. Chen is here because she's named in Victoria's will," Pierce said calmly. He was a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He gestured to a chair. "Please, Mrs. Chen, have a seat." I sat across the table from Natasha, who was staring at me with undisguised hostility. Next to her sat a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, expensive suit, carrying himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from inherited wealth. He was typing on his phone and barely looked up when I entered. "This is my brother, Richard," Natasha said coldly. "He's here to protect my interests." "I wasn't aware your interests needed protecting," I said before I could stop myself. Richard looked up from his phone for the first time, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Anytime there's money involved, interests need protecting, Mrs. Chen." I'm sure you understand." Actually, I didn't understand, but I kept my mouth shut and waited for Pierce to begin. He opened a leather folder and pulled out several documents. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time, but Victoria was very specific about her wishes, and I intend to honor them to the letter." He looked at each of us in turn. "Before we begin, I want to make something clear. This will was created 2 years ago and updated 3 weeks before Victoria's death. She was of sound mind and under no duress when she made these decisions. I witnessed the most recent changes myself. 3 weeks before her death, Victoria had updated her will 3 weeks before she died. Had she known something? Had there been signs of illness I'd missed? Or had she simply been one of those responsible people who kept their affairs in order? Pierce began reading. The first part was exactly what I'd expected. Natasha inherited the house, Victoria's car, her retirement accounts, and her life insurance policy. Each item was read aloud with specific dollar amounts attached. The house was worth $420,000. The retirement accounts totaled $95,000. The life insurance was $350,000. Natasha nodded smugly at each item, occasionally glancing at me as if to rub in everything she was inheriting. Then Pierce's tone changed slightly. "However, there are several additional provisions that Victoria added in her most recent revision." He pulled out a separate document sealed with red wax. "These provisions are detailed in a sealed codicil that Victoria instructed me to open only in the presence of all named beneficiaries." Natasha leaned forward. "What kind of provisions?" Pierce broke the wax seal and unfolded the document. "I'll read it in its entirety, and then we can discuss any questions." He cleared his throat and began to read in a measured voice. "To my wife, Natasha Marie Brennan Chen, I leave the house, car, and accounts detailed in the primary will. However, I must note that the house was purchased with a down payment of $35,000 provided by my mother, Margaret Chen, which was explicitly described at the time as a loan, not a gift. Documentation of this loan, including emails, text messages, and bank transfer records, has been provided to my attorney and is attached as Exhibit A." Natasha's face went pale. Pierce continued, "I am not requiring immediate repayment of this loan, as I trust that my wife will honor this debt of her own accord. However, should she choose not to repay my mother within a reasonable time frame, or should she treat my mother with anything less than the respect and care she deserves, I have made additional arrangements to ensure my mother's financial security." "This is ridiculous," Natasha interrupted. "That money was a gift. Victoria said—" "Please let me finish," Pierce said firmly. "Then you can raise your objections." He read on. "To my mother, Margaret Chen, I leave the contents of 2 safety deposit boxes held at First Republic Bank, boxes 2847 and 2848, along with all associated documentation, account information, and access credentials. My mother is to have sole and exclusive access to these boxes and their contents. Under no circumstances is my spouse to be given information about these boxes or their contents without my mother's explicit written consent." The room went completely silent. Natasha found her voice first. "Safety deposit boxes? What safety deposit boxes? Victoria never mentioned any safety deposit boxes." "That's because she opened them without your knowledge," Pierce said simply, which was entirely her right. She maintained these boxes for approximately 4 years. "What's in them?" Richard demanded, his lawyer instincts fully activated now. "I have no idea," Pierce admitted. "Victoria never shared that information with me. She simply provided the keys, the box numbers, and instructions that Mrs. Chen should have complete access upon her death." He pulled 2 small keys from an envelope and slid them across the table to me. I stared at them, trying to understand what was happening. "There's more," Pierce said, returning to the document. "In addition to the safety deposit boxes, I leave to my mother all rights and access to investment account, Dirk 7849, 2847-3391 at Wellington Financial Group and account W9283-4455-9912 at Fairfield Investments. Documentation for these accounts is included in Safety Deposit Box 2847. Investment accounts. Victoria had investment accounts I didn't know about. Natasha was on her feet now. This is insane. If Victoria had investment accounts, they should be part of the marital estate. I'm contesting this will immediately. You're welcome to try, Pierce said calmly. But I should inform you that Victoria consulted extensively with me about estate law before making these decisions. These accounts were funded entirely with money she received before your marriage, and she maintained them in her name only. They're not part of the marital estate. Before our marriage? That was 8 years ago. What money could she possibly have had that she kept secret for 8 years? Pierce looked at Natasha with something that might have been pity. Perhaps you should ask yourself why your wife felt the need to keep these accounts secret, Mrs. Chen. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, clutching the 2 small keys that represented some unknown future. Natasha had stormed out immediately after the reading, her brother in tow, shouting threats about lawsuits and contested wills. But Pierce had assured me that everything was legally airtight. Victoria was meticulous, he'd told me after they left. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she made sure every detail would hold up in court. Whatever is in those boxes, Mrs. Chen, your daughter wanted you to have it. But what could possibly be in there? The next morning, I drove to First Republic Bank with the keys in my purse and Victoria's death certificate in a folder. The bank manager, a pleasant woman named Sarah Lynn, was expecting me. Pierce had apparently called ahead to smooth the process. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Chen," she said as she led me through the security procedures. Victoria was a valued client. She came in regularly to access her boxes. How regularly? At least once a month for the past several years. Sometimes more often. She paused at the vault entrance. She was very particular about privacy, always insisted on using the private viewing rooms. We went through the security protocols, ID verification, death certificate review, signature comparisons. Finally, Sarah used her master key while I used Victoria's keys, and 2 long, deep safety deposit boxes slid out from the wall. "Take all the time you need," Sarah said, helping me carry the boxes to a private viewing room. "I'll be at my desk when you're ready." Alone in the small, windowless room, I stared at the 2 boxes for a long moment before opening the first one. Inside was a letter, placed right on top where I couldn't miss it. My hands trembled as I recognized Victoria's handwriting. "Dearest Mom, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I won't be there to take care of you the way you always took care of me. I'm sorry for leaving you alone, and I'm especially sorry for what Natasha has probably already put you through. I know my wife, Mom. I've known for years what kind of person she really is. I've seen how she treats you when she thinks I'm not paying attention. The little cruelties, the dismissive comments, the way she makes you feel like a burden. I've watched her plan our life together as if you don't exist or don't matter. And I've been preparing for this possibility for 4 years. Tears blurred my vision. I had to stop and wipe my eyes before I could continue reading. 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with a heart condition. Nothing immediately life-threatening, the doctors said, but something that significantly increased my risk of sudden cardiac events. They put me on medication and told me to avoid stress and maintain a healthy lifestyle. I never told you because I didn't want you to worry. I never told Natasha because I didn't trust her with that information. I knew that if she knew I was at risk, she might start planning for my death before I was even gone. That sounds terrible to write, but it's true. I've seen the way she looks at our insurance policies. I've heard her and Richard discussing investments and inheritances at family dinners. I know that she married me partly for love and partly for security. So I started preparing. I took the $35,000 you gave us for the down payment, money Natasha claimed was a gift, but which I knew you saw as a loan, and I invested it. I was good at my job, Mom, but I was also good at investing. I studied, I learned, I took calculated risks that paid off. Over 4 years, that $35,000 has grown into something much more substantial. How much, you'll see when you access the investment accounts. But I want you to know that every dollar came from your initial investment, plus careful management. Nothing came from marital funds. Nothing came from money Natasha could claim belonged to her. This is your money, Mom, your security, your future. I set down the letter for a moment, my heart pounding. I pulled out the investment account statements that were neatly organized in the box beneath the letter. My eyes scanned the balance sheets. Wellington Financial Group, $287,000. Fairfield Investments, $223,000. Over $500,000. I sat back hard in the chair, the room spinning around me. Victoria had turned my $35,000 loan into more than $500,000. My daughter, who I'd been so worried about leaving alone with Natasha, had been quietly building my future security while I cooked dinner and tried not to be a burden. I picked up the letter again with shaking hands. I know what you're thinking, Mom. This is too much. You don't deserve this. You shouldn't have to live off your daughter's investments. But please understand, this isn't charity. This is return on investment. This is me honoring the debt I owed you, both financial and otherwise. You gave me the down payment for our house. More than that, you gave me everything. Every sacrifice you made so I could have piano lessons, go to college, pursue my dreams. Every time you went without so I could have more. Every bit of support and love and belief in me. This is me paying it forward, or paying it back, maybe both. Now, about Natasha. I love her, Mom. That might seem strange to say given everything I've written, but it's true. I love her despite her flaws, despite her selfishness, despite knowing that she'd probably throw you out of the house the day after my funeral. Yes, I know she'd do that. I've heard her joke about it with her sister. I've seen her plan for it in quiet moments when she thinks I'm not watching. That's why I made sure you'd have somewhere to go, something to live on, a future that doesn't depend on her charity. But I also want you to have some answers, and I want you to have leverage if you need it. I looked at the second safety deposit box, which I hadn't yet opened. Taking a deep breath, I lifted the lid. This box was filled with files, printed emails, text message screenshots, financial documents, photographs. Everything was organized with colored tabs and labeled with dates. The first file was labeled Financial Deception. I opened it to find bank statements showing that Natasha had been hiding money in a separate account, an account funded with regular transfers from their joint account. $500 here, $1,000 there, always just under the threshold that might have triggered Victoria's attention if she hadn't been looking for it. The transfers added up to over $40,000 over the course of 3 years. The next file was labeled Communications About Margaret. This one was harder to read. Pages and pages of text messages between Natasha and various friends and family members, all complaining about me, calling me a burden, a freeloader, an inconvenience, planning ways to get me out of the house. One message to her sister, dated 6 months before Victoria's death. I swear, if V dies before Margaret does, I'm changing the locks the same day. I'm not spending my widow years taking care of her elderly mother. Another message to a friend. I can't wait until we can turn Margaret's room into a home gym. V is too soft-hearted to kick her out, but the second something happens to V, that old woman is gone. I felt sick reading them, but I forced myself to continue. Victoria had wanted me to see this. She'd wanted me to understand. The third file was labeled Medical Records. I opened it cautiously, not sure what I'd find. Inside were copies of Victoria's medical records going back 4 years, the diagnosis of cardiomyopathy, the prescriptions, the doctor's notes recommending stress reduction and lifestyle changes. And then, 3 months before her death, a new set of records. Victoria had gone to see a specialist about her medication. The notes from that appointment made my blood run cold. Patient reports that medication is being stored in unlocked bathroom cabinet. Patient concerned about wife's friend, who is a pharmacist and has been visiting the house frequently. Patient reports wife has been asking detailed questions about the medications and their side effects. Patient advised to store medication in locked location and to inform spouse about serious nature of condition. I stared at those words, reading them over and over. Victoria had been worried about Natasha having access to her medication. The next document in the file was a toxicology report from the night of Victoria's accident. It showed significantly elevated levels of her heart medication in her system. Levels that would have been dangerous, possibly fatal even without a car accident. And then the final document. A letter Victoria had written but apparently never sent. It was addressed to the police. To whom it may concern, I'm writing this letter as a precaution, to be opened only if I die under circumstances that could be considered suspicious. Over the past 3 months, I have noticed that my medication levels seem inconsistent with what I'm taking. I have been experiencing episodes of extreme drowsiness, dizziness, and confusion that are not consistent with my prescribed dosage. My wife, Natasha Chen, has recently begun showing unusual interest in my medications and their effects. She has also been meeting regularly with a friend who is a pharmacist, and I have twice found my pill bottles moved or opened when I know I left them closed. I hope I'm being paranoid. I hope this letter never needs to be read. But if something happens to me, particularly something involving my heart condition or a car accident, please investigate whether my medication was tampered with. I have provided copies of all relevant medical records, prescriptions, and a list of people who have had access to my medications. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Victoria's death. I sat in that small room, surrounded by evidence of my daughter's fear and suspicion, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Victoria hadn't just been preparing for the possibility of dying from her heart condition. She'd been afraid that Natasha might kill her. I spent 2 more hours in that bank viewing room, reading through every document Victoria had left me. By the time I emerged, I had a complete picture of my daughter's last years, her growing awareness of Natasha's true nature, her careful financial planning, her fear and suspicion, and ultimately her love for me, expressed through the safety net she'd built. I also had a decision to make. The toxicology report and Victoria's unsent letter to the police were circumstantial at best. The elevated medication levels could have been explained by Victoria accidentally taking extra doses, especially if she'd been confused or drowsy. The car accident had been ruled an accident, with no indication of foul play. The police had closed the case, but I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew that Natasha had killed my daughter. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Sarah Lynn helped me arrange for the documents to be scanned and saved to a secure cloud account, with physical copies sent to Jonathan Pierce's office for safekeeping. I left the bank with copies of the investment account information and a new sense of purpose. For the first time since Victoria's death, I had a plan. Step 1 was securing my own future. I met with a financial advisor that afternoon, someone Pierce had recommended who specialized in managing inherited assets. She explained the accounts Victoria had set up, walked me through the tax implications, and helped me understand exactly what I had. After taxes and fees,